So go ahead and open to Judges chapter 2 and 3, which is where we left off. And we're going to talk through basically today the 6 sin cycles in Judges. So we talked about the sin cycle, which is described in Judges 2:10, Judges 2:11 and following. That basically in that chapter lays out not something that I or anybody else has made up, but actually the outline for how the book of Judges works. That basically they go into the sin wheel or the sin cycle. And you guys remember what was, and it's okay if you don't remember every single step, but if you get the main point, do you guys remember what does the sin cycle entail in Judges? And you can look in chapter 2. Yeah.
I believe it was sin.
Okay.
Exile.
Well, yeah, exile, judgment. They're under slavery. Yep. Okay.
A cry for mercy or repentance.
Cry for mercy. Okay. Good.
Salvation.
Okay, but through
judge.
Yeah, they send a judge. Okay, God sends a judge.
And it was war, I think, or no.
Well, the judge, usually fights a battle or something. So yeah, that's true.
And then peace.
Then they have peace.
And then sin again.
And then they start sin all over. Yeah. So as long as you guys get that, how that kind of works. Again, you don't. There's different ways of saying it, but as long as you understand, they are in a place where they're kind of okay with God. They're in a time period of peace. Then they fall into sin and idolatry. They forget God. Then they cry out. God has pity on them, sends a judge. The judge brings about deliverance and peace or rest for another period of time. Then eventually they go back into sin, forgetting God and idolatry again. And I actually made a mistake. Well, actually a couple mistakes yesterday. I said I was adding up the numbers. That's all right. I was adding up the numbers wrong. So it is a little bit more than a couple of hundred. It is more than 100 years plus, because I wasn't adding together the years of peace plus the years of rest. So like the first cycle, they have 8 years under Mesopotamia and then 40 years. Okay, so so it adds up to a couple hundred years throughout the book of Judges. Okay, so we'll talk through that. And do you guys remember what the key phrase was of how you know you're beginning a new cycle in Judges? We talked about it yesterday, but yeah.
Israel did was wrong in the sight of the Lord.
Yes, there you go. Yeah, Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. So that's, as soon as you read that, you know a new cycle is basically beginning. Okay, so we'll talk through these cycles. The Judges go from pretty good to kind of okay to bad to worse. Okay, the video did a good job of emphasizing that cycle. Okay, of the judges themselves. God will use them. God will temporarily empower them uniquely for His purposes with the Holy Spirit. However, they are not good guys in a lot of cases. And that's one of the things that's so disappointing to people, like I told you about the kids crying because they found out Samson is not, someone to be emulated. But, there are good examples in the Bible and there are bad examples. We'll get into Samuel, and Samuel's definitely someone who should be followed as an example, but, Samson, not so much. So we'll probably get through, hopefully all 6 cycles, probably get through about 5 cycles, because we'll talk through these things. But yes, Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the cycles are not all the same size, okay, so they're not proportional. Sometimes the periods of the judge, the period of rest, the period of bondage, some are shorter, some are longer, okay. And then some judges we don't hear as much about, like the first guy, Othniel. You don't hear much about him because there's just not that much to know. He's a pretty good guy. He accomplishes God's purposes, and there's not too much said about him. Okay, and that's kind of a good thing. Like I worked at but I've heard of at a school. There was a principal, there's a school much bigger than ours, and he was telling parents, he's like, if I don't know your kid right away, don't feel bad. That may just mean that they're just kind of doing their thing, doing what they're supposed to be doing, and keeping their head down and doing their work. If I know your kid, that could be good, that could be bad, right? So it's not like here where, we have a small school. Okay, but let's talk about some of these cycles. So I'll read you just the first one because it's short with Othniel, the first judge, in 3:7. You can hear the cycle. The sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and they forgot Yahweh their God and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. And let me just pause there. Remember, one of the big things is not just they sin, but they forget God. That's the key aspect of their sin. They move in, they become just like the nations around them. They adopt all their gods, they adopt all their pagan practices, and so they participate in those things. And so it says, then the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan Rishathaim, the king of Mesopotamia. And the sons of Israel served Cushan Rishathaim for 8 years. When the sons of Israel cried out to Yahweh, Yahweh raised up a deliverer. Okay, that's also a term for the judge. A deliverer for the sons of Israel to deliver them. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. Hey guys, let's Timmy. Let's not keep talking back there. The Spirit of Yahweh came upon him, and he judged Israel. When he went out to war, Yahweh gave Cushan Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, so that he prevailed over him. Then the land had rest for 40 years, and Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. Now it gets back into it again. They did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So here's what happens. You see cycle number 1, Othniel, the enemy that they do evil in the sight of the Lord, the enemy that God sends onto them. And it's interesting how this is described in Judges, is that he sold them into bondage, right? So remember, they come out originally from slavery in Egypt, but when they sin, God gives them back into slavery, which is, right, the Bible talks about being slaves to sin, right? And Ezra and Nehemiah will end the historical part of the Bible, of the Old Testament, by saying we are slaves to this day, meaning we began in slavery, we continued in slavery through different cycles, and now we're still in slavery, okay? Because they're ultimately, Israel's enslaved to sin. Okay, so they're under Mesopotamia for 8 years. God raises up Othniel. One interesting detail is, who is he related to that you and I know from earlier, who's a good guy? Who's he related to? It says it on the board, but it also says it in 3... let's see here. It says it in 3:9. Yeah.
Caleb?
Yeah, he's Caleb's younger brother. Okay, so Caleb, remember, goes in with Joshua. So Caleb's brother is a good guy as well, God uses. Okay, don't know too much about him. And then also it says, I'm going to write something down here as a key term. It says that the land had rest. Okay, so remember, I'm going to add here, I think it's Joshua 23:1. It says Joshua gave them rest from all their enemies. Well, they go into slavery, they don't have rest. Okay, now the judge comes, provides temporary rest. So then the kings will come, David and Solomon will come, and says they gave them rest from all their enemies. But they're not able to fully do it. Okay, so that's what the author of Hebrews will pick up on. He says, throughout Old Testament history, you've had all these individuals, deliverers, kings, give the people temporary rest, but they never gave them full rest. That's why it was looking ahead to Christ, okay, who can actually provide full rest. And so the author of Hebrews says, you can't avoid Jesus, but he's the one who provides superior rest. Okay, so So that's cycle one. So the idea of rest or peace is important. The wording, it will help you understand the Old and New Testament, because that's what David will provide and will Solomon. But they won't be able to provide rest permanently. Why? Why won't David and Solomon, even though they're kings, be able to provide rest permanently?
Because they will fall back into sin.
They'll fall into sin too, and so it will undo the rest. Okay. Next judge. Some of these judges are more familiar to you. Obviously Samson, probably Deborah, probably Gideon. But some of these are probably less familiar. I don't think anybody's probably before this morning heard of Othniel. Maybe you've read about it, but it's not typically like a Sunday school like that you taught as a kid or something. It's very simple. Okay, but Ehud, okay, is the next one. Is in 3:12 through 3:31. Okay, again, Israel does evil in the sight of the Lord, and I'll read a little bit of this one. But Ehud is a left-handed judge. We'll talk about him in a second. The enemy that takes over for 18 years is Moab, led by the king Eglon. Okay, he's the king of the Moabites. And Ehud is left-handed, which is important for this story. But left-handed, who in here is left-handed? Anybody? Abigail, Amelia? Okay, got two people in here. Okay, so it's about left-handedness is, as we know, is most people are right-handed, so it's a little bit unusual. It's not a bad thing, but in this time, being left-handed was seen culturally as being kind of weird, kind of off. And so this would be kind of an unexpected person to use, but his left-handedness is actually going to be important because he is going to be used to assassinate Eglon, the king of the Moabites. Okay, but here's the problem: if you go in and you try to take in a weapon, if you're right-handed, you'd put the weapon here, and that's where they would check. If you're left-handed, you'd put the weapon here, the knife or something here, but they wouldn't check you there. Okay, so basically, this is what Ehud, his advantage that he's going to have in kind of an unexpected way. Now again, some of the stories, especially on like Monday, that we'll get into, I already kind of highlighted some of these things ahead of time for you guys, or told you some of what's going to happen. But these are very dark, they're very disturbing stories. Okay, this one is a little bit, not crass, but it's a little bit funny in a way. It's like it talks about assassination, but there's a little bit of humor, I think, built in here. So he goes in, listen to Judges 3:16. Okay, or let's start in 15. When the sons of Israel cried to Yahweh, and Yahweh raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. And the sons of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, the king of Moab. Okay, do you guys know what tribute is? When you send tribute to a king?
Like an offering?
Sort of. It's a mandatory offering, basically. Tribute is like this. If a king conquers some area, he says, okay, I'm going to provide for you protection, but you're going to have to be under my laws. Here's the consequences if you don't listen. And basically, at regularly scheduled, well, it wasn't always regularly scheduled, but he demands payment in the form of what? What do you have to pay to if a conqueror takes over? We call it a little bit of a softer term, taxes. Yeah. So you have to pay tribute. Okay. So they send in Ehud to bring this tribute to the king. Okay. And so it's like he's taken their tax or their kind of gift, and so it says in verse 16, Ehud made a sword which had two edges, a cubit in length, so about 18 inches long, and he bound it on his right thigh under his cloak. He presented tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now here's where it gets a little bit funny. Now Eglon was a very fat man. And so I don't know, we don't know how fat, but if you watch, maybe don't watch this, but see around on 600-pound Life, shows like this. I don't know if he could have gotten that big back then, but being fat in the ancient world was a sign of wealth, of prominence, of somebody who could acquire a lot of resources. So we know this guy's really big, okay? And it's important for the story. He's not just throwing this out here. Okay, so very fat man. It came about when he finished presenting tribute that he sent away the people who carried the tribute. So he sends away the attendants who were taking the money and the offering. And he says, but he himself turned back from the idols which were at Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And he said, keep silence. And all who attended left him. So now he says, okay, don't share your secret message yet. Let me send everybody out of the room, and we're going to go up to this private chamber where you can tell me the message, okay? Now this is where it gets a little bit gross, and I'll try not to be crass here, but it is what it said. I do have to describe what it says. Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber. And Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. And he arose from his seat, meaning Ehud arose from his seat. Okay. Now, in the cool roof chamber, what this is basically saying without saying, and it will be evident from the next couple of verses, is this is Eglon's kind of fancy private bathroom chamber. Okay. So that was one of the places where they know he has to go to the bathroom, and he knows that he and Ehud can be alone to hear the secret message. As strange as that sounds, even in medieval England and Europe, one of the coveted positions, as this is going to sound really strange, is called the Lord of the Stool, where you'd basically be a bathroom attendant. You'd hold the stool for the king's feet while he was in the bathroom. Now, why is that a coveted position? Well, because you are trusted to be with the king alone when he's vulnerable, and you'd talk, and you'd usually become an advisor. And remember, we don't have, we have indoor plumbing and stuff, so you have to think about, kind of in a different format. Their world is not the same as ours. So Ehud is allowed to be with him while he's in there basically going to the bathroom. Okay, as strange as that sounds. Now, this is going to be key to how Ehud's able to assassinate him and get away. So he said, okay, I have a secret message. I'm going to come whisper it to you, basically. And so he got up from his seat, and Ehud stretched out his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. Okay, now he stabs him. Okay, that would be good enough. But look what happens. The handle also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw out the sword from his belly. Let me pause there for a minute. So he stabs Eglon, and the fat basically sucks it in, and then it closes out, and Ehud's like, my knife. No, I'm just kidding. So, and Ehud just leaves it in. Okay, well, it gets worse. There's more. Somebody read verse 3, verse 22.
I don't want to read verse 3:22. That's low. I don't want to.
I didn't even finish the verse.
No, I don't want to.
Who wants to read? Okay, let's do Hudson. Read 3:22.
3. Give me a sec.
Okay.
3. The handle also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the sword out of his belly, and refused to come out. Then Ehud went out into the vestibule.
Okay, hang on. You just read the last phrase of 22, not 23. So after it says the sword, he didn't take the sword out of his belly.
And refused to come out.
No. And refuse came out.
Oh.
So basically, the guy's in the middle of going to the bathroom is what it's saying. So it's like he stabs him, and the refuse, the waste, came out. Okay. Now, it's supposed to go out, one way, and it comes out the other way. Okay. So now why this is important is because this, as odd as it sounds, is actually what helps Ehud to escape. So Ehud leaves the bathroom chamber and locks the door, and the attendants get kind of worried about the king. But he's, either dead or dying in there. And they go up to the door, and they smell what's going on in there, and they're like, oh, he's going to the bathroom. And so they wait a long time, and then they're like, we're starting to get really worried. And then so they unlock the door, and by that time Ehud has escaped. And then since Eglon was able to lead the Moabites and have their army fight, but they're basically not able to handle it without him there. There's no organization without the king to lead them. And so Ehud is able to give Israel, the army, victory over Moab, okay? And gives them a period of rest for 80 years. Yeah.
Okay, so he stabs him,
Yes.
fat absorbs it,
Correct.
and then crap comes out.
Crap comes out.
Oh,
That's what happened.
Interesting story.
Yeah, it is an interesting story.
Makes the Bible
Well,
so great.
yeah, exactly. It's like it says things like he's a very fat man. Well, it's important to the story. Yeah.
Nowadays battles are more exciting.
What's that?
Nowadays battles are so boring.
Yeah.
Nowadays they're more like that.
Yeah. Okay. So next one. Okay, this one doesn't have as much. It does have some violence, but not as much. Anything gross in it. Well, not in that way. Okay, Deborah is the next judge. Okay. Okay, female judge. Okay. 4:1 through 5:31. Okay. In this case, the enemy is Canaan. Okay, and one of the generals is Sisera. Okay, God sells them into bondage for 20 years to the Canaanites. Okay, Deborah is raised up as a judge. She used to sit under a tree, and she would kind of, the Spirit would kind of use her to prophesy and things like this. So she would kind of, I think we can infer, because she writes a song in a victory in chapter 5, that maybe she's writing kind of songs, kind of think like the Psalms would be, kind of worship songs and things like that. So they write a victory song for Deborah and the other general, Barak. Okay. Now Deborah, yes, is one of the female judges, but what this is indicating to us, hinting at for this time, is that there is no effective male leadership. Okay. There's not a Joshua. There's not a Caleb. There's not a Moses. There's not an Ehud or an Othniel. Okay, so there's not somebody who's taking over effectively as a male, and so Deborah is in the position basically to lead Israel. So she is raised up as a judge. Okay, and goes and fights the Canaanites. They fight in this battle. Okay, so the story begins with a woman and ends with a woman. Deborah and Barak have this victory over the Canaanites, but one of the generals escapes, and there's this woman, Yael, who tricks him and assassinates him. Okay, now listen to Judges 4:17. Now Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Yael, the wife of Heber the Canaanite, for there was peace between Jabin, the king of Hazor, and Heber, the king of Kenite, or Heber the Kenite. Yael went to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my master. Turn aside to me. Do not be afraid." And he turned aside to her and went into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. And he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." So she opened a bottle of milk and gave him a drink. And he said, "I asked for water." No, I'm just kidding. And so she gave him milk to drink, and then she covered him. And he said to her, "Stand in the doorway of the tent, and it shall be, if anyone comes and inquires of you and says, 'Is anyone there?' then you shall say no." Okay, so he's like, keep guard. So he thinks, okay, I'm safe, can rest. He's exhausted. He lays down under a blanket. He drinks some water, okay, or drinks some milk. And so Yael now is going to assassinate him. How does she assassinate him? Patrick.
With a tent peg.
With a tent peg. Yes, she takes a tent peg out of the ground. Look at verse 21. But Yael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg and seized the hammer in her hand and went secretly to him and drove the tent peg into his temple, and it went through into the ground, for he was sound asleep and exhausted, so he died. It's like, I think it's funny when the Bible adds little phrases like that. So he died. It's like he had a tent peg driven through his head all the way to the ground. Okay, which meant that it wasn't like she just went like this. It went all the way through to the ground. Like you have to hammer. And it's not that easy to do that. Just to give you guys an idea. Skulls are pretty hard. Yeah.
Wait, do you think that he like
Felt it? I don't know.
died right away, or do you think he kind of like woke up and then like?
I have no idea. Yeah, there was a cartoon version of this where I was like, how are they going to handle this? But they basically just had her going into the tent and him being like, well, yeah, basically being like, what are you doing?
You get knocked out pretty fast.
So yeah, you'd probably die pretty quickly.
Because like brain, if your
So-
brain goes dead like that.
If your brain hits your
brain
skull,
would be like cracked.
Done, because how big was the peg? That's the question. Because
Yeah, so big enough to nail a tent down to the ground. So
probably
I don't know.
because of a pretty brain.
But anyway, okay, so story begins, we'll close it up that part, but story begins with a woman, Deborah, okay, ends with a woman, Yael, okay, and so it shows like these guys who would seem to be like unconquerable military leaders, God uses this woman in a tent to bring him down, okay, and so Deborah gives them rest for 40 years, okay, there's a song of Deborah in Judges 5, a worship song for God's victory there. And then another well-known judge is Gideon in 6:1 through 8:28. So remember the amounts of scripture covered here are not always the same. The Midianites take over Israel for 7 years because of their sin. Okay, Gideon, there's more written about him, but he is down in a wine press, which is kind of a cave underground. The angel of the Lord appears to him and tells him to, lead the people. And kind of like Moses, he says, "I'm not going to be able to." He's afraid. He says, "I'm not a warrior." And God, tells him, "I'm going to be with you." Right. So, and this is angel of the Lord speaks like God. He says, "I am Yahweh, your God," and stuff like this. So Gideon and others see this individual show up. Okay. Now Gideon kind of wants to test, get a sign from God that he understands him correctly. Oh, before that, Gideon has to destroy a big idol that belongs to his father. Okay, so there's this big idol of Baal. I guess it's vintage, please. There's this big idol of Baal that would have been hugely expensive. People would worship it, and it belongs to Gideon's father, and it would have taken a lot of costs to put together. It would have taken a lot of work, and then the people have an attachment to it because they worship it. And God tells Gideon, "Go destroy this." Okay. Now imagine if, this morning, you went and you destroyed. This isn't even equivalent, but it's close enough. If you went and beat up your parents' car with a baseball bat and destroyed it and then pushed it off like a cliff. Okay, that's what Gideon does to his father's idol. And the people, and he could have died for that. The people, were very upset at first. But then his father comes out and is like, "No, he's right. We should follow the Lord alone." And so they now kind of recognize that Gideon's being used as the judge to destroy idolatry. Okay. Now Gideon wants a sign from God before he goes and fights the Midianites. He basically says, "God, I'll know you're with me if you take this." It's called a fleece, but it's kind of like a washcloth. And he says, "If I put it on the ground at night and then I wake up in the morning and all the ground is really dry, but the fleece is wet, I know that will be a sign that you're with me." And he's like, "Okay." So God allows that. Then he's like, "Oh, but what if something got spilled onto this?" Okay, so now he says, "Okay, God, I want the ground to be all wet, and then the fleece, the washcloth, to be dry." And God does that. Now God flips it around on him and tests Gideon. So he gathers, these men to fight, and he says, "Okay." God says, "Okay, now we're gonna we have this big force. Now we're gonna cut down on the army. All the men that are afraid, send them home." Okay, which is from Deuteronomy as well. Now he says, we're going to send home a few more. He says, "Tell the men to go get water." Okay, And there's basically going to be two different ways of getting water. The smarter, more experienced military men, if you're like in a war zone where there's danger, somebody could be throwing a spear, shooting an arrow, or attacking you in some way, what do you try to do? You try to make, what do you try to do and not do to kind of make yourself conspicuous or hide, or what do you, if you're going to go out into water and you're not sure if there could be enemies nearby, what might you try to do to avoid getting hit or caught? Or
Do it quickly.
hide. Do it quickly, hide. Yeah. The first rule in like a war zone is you keep your head low. You stay low to the ground. So the smart guys, the experienced guys, are going to crawl up, kind of like army crawl up to the water, drink by putting their face down in the water, keep their eyes up. The inexperienced guys are just going to walk down to the water and not care. And then God's going to say, okay, Gideon, everybody who was smart enough to crawl down, send them home. Okay? And so then they're left with about 300 men. And yeah, that's one. And they're not going to have swords. What God is going to do is that he's going to have Gideon and the men surround the camp, put the torches in clay pots so that the light is covered, and then when Gideon gives the signal, they're going to break the pots or move the pots so that all the light shows up around them. They're supposed to yell for Yahweh and for Gideon, okay, so that the Midianites know who's showing up. Okay, so they do this, and the Midianites flee and get so scared that they're surrounded by this big army because they can't see in the dark. They just see a bunch of light and yelling. And these guys don't even have swords, Gideon's army. And the Midianites start fleeing. They start getting so confused in the dark that they start killing each other and running away. Okay, so he has victory over the Midianites, and he gives them rest for how many years is it here? 40 years, okay, of rest. Okay. Now Gideon is not. We've already seen his imperfections in certain ways, but after that he has a lot of wives. He has like 70 children because he has so many wives, and then he makes an idol out of gold and stuff like this. He kills he and his group kill a village who didn't help them. So stuff like this, that Gideon is not such a good guy in certain ways as well. So it's a mixed bag. Then you get to Jephthah. Okay, Jephthah is probably a judge that you guys have not heard that much about. The enemy in this case is Ammon, or the Ammonites. They bring Israel into bondage for 18 years. Jephthah is very unfamiliar with God, his nature, and his character. He's kind of a thug, kind of a guy who just lives up in the mountains, and he views God as being like the other Canaanite gods. And the other Canaanite gods required child sacrifice. Okay? So he makes this rash vow. Okay? So he says to God, if you give me victory, when I come home, I will sacrifice the first thing that comes through the door, thinking, of course, it's going to be some animal. He'll fulfill a vow of sacrifice, a sheep, goat, an ox or something that walks through. But he gets home, and his daughter comes out of the door with like a tambourine, and she's like celebrating, and is like, excited that her dad's home, and had this victory that she's heard about. And now he's like, oh my gosh, I've made this vow to God to sacrifice whatever comes through the door, and my daughter has come through the door. Oof. And so he's like, well, the other Canaanite gods, they accept child sacrifice. Maybe this. So there's a little bit of a different interpretation on this. Some people think there's what's called the perpetual virginity interpretation, which has nothing to do with the Catholic doctrine. It sounds like that. But basically, the daughter asks, she recognizes that she's going to have to be sacrificed. She says, can I go to the mountains for 40 days to weep and mourn because I never got to get married, I never got to have kids, I never got to pass on my genes to the next generation, and so can I go weep? And so one interpretation says that she went and wept and then came home and she never married, never had kids, and that was kind of the sacrifice. And people would say, well, that's more in line with God's character. I agree. However, Jephthah is unfamiliar with God's character. I think Jephthah, that the book of Judges is showing us that the situation is so bad, even the leadership is so unfamiliar with God and his ways and his character, that they think it's appropriate to offer child sacrifice, that this is what God would want. And so I think he does sacrifice her. So I've heard it both ways. My dad follows the first interpretation. I follow the second one, because God is not condoning this. He's saying, I think he's highlighting it because it's bad. That this is the what happens if people don't know God. They start to think, okay, well, God must want me to do these things, right? So, okay, what time are we at? 9:29. Okay, we got about 10 minutes here. It's good. Okay, last judge, most well known, is of course Samson. Okay, from 13:1 to 16:31. And Samson is brought up to fight the Philistines. The Philistines are the ones who overtake Israel for 40 years. Okay, so this is a long period of bondage. Okay. Samson is known obviously for his strength. He is what is called a Nazirite, okay, which means he has this vow that he's made to God. You can be a Nazirite temporarily. It's basically where you swear a vow and you wouldn't cut your hair until the vow is fulfilled. Okay, so that vow could be a couple days, could be a couple weeks, or it could be lifelong. Okay, John the Baptist will kind of be a little bit similar to this, except he'll be a righteous man. So he is born of unique circumstances. It says God calls him from the womb. He says he's making Samson. Okay, and he is basically called to fight the Philistines. Now Samson has a wife who you've heard of. Okay, probably. What's his wife's name? The wife that you know. Maybe you don't know. Samson and Delilah. Okay. He has a wife before that. Did you guys know that? Did you really know that? I didn't know that until a few years ago. I don't know if they ever give her a name. They just call her a woman of Timnah. But he has a wife, and she ends up getting through some circumstances. They're getting killed and basically burned on a heap. With her father and stuff. So, and it has to do with Samson and other things. Now, Samson's able to fight the Philistines. He's able to fight wild animals. He's strong, and God allows his supernatural strength to be through his long hair. Okay, but Samson is sexually immoral, and because he falls into sexual sin, he keeps going back to Delilah, who's trying to sell him to the Philistines, basically. And so she brings him, she keeps asking him, what's your secret? What's your secret? But he's able to break out of whenever she tries to tie him up, okay? Eventually he gets sick of it, but he keeps going back to her, right? His sexual immorality keeps pulling him back in to sin. And it's eventually what brings him down. And then Samson eventually gets his hair cut off, okay, and then he is captured by the Philistines. Okay, now this is kind of gross, but it is an important detail, especially for one of the points of the book of Judges. Okay, when they capture Samson and he's tied up, what do they do to him? It's in 1621.
They blinded.
They blind him, yeah. They poke out his eyes. Okay. Now remember, this is what happened, but also what Judges keeps repeating is everyone does what is right in his own eyes. Okay, so now Samson is blinded. Okay. And so they take him into prison. He calls out to God in prison, and then his hair continues to grow as he's there. So now they bring him out into this kind of area where they're going to probably taunt and execute him, and saying, our gods are stronger than yours. Let's bring out Samson so he can amuse us. Let's mess with him, that he's blind, and maybe torture and kill him. And so Samson puts his hands on the pillars, okay, and he cries out to God in verse 16, verse 28. It says, "Then Samson called to Yahweh and said, 'O Lord Yahweh, please remember me. Please strengthen me just this time, O God, that I may at once avenge the Philistines for my 2 eyes.'" Okay, so, and then he grasps the 2 middle pillars, pulls down the house, and everybody there dies. Kind of interesting, there's a reference to this, or an allusion to this, in the New Testament, where he says, "Lord, remember me." This is similar to the wording of the thief on the cross. "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." So Samson says, "Okay, Lord, let me have my strength one last time," and he kills the Philistines. Okay, so he provides rest for them for 20 years. Okay, now there's still more of Judges to go. We got 17 through 21. We'll just finish up here in a second. But there's and this is where I made a little bit of a mistake yesterday as well, or didn't state it quite accurately. There's this little town that starts to get a reputation that we sing a song about at Christmas, and it has this kind of trilogy here. You guys remember what town this is?
Bethlehem.
Bethlehem, yeah. So what we see next is what we could call the bad Bethlehem trilogy. And what I said was, I made it sound like there was, that all these events were happening in Bethlehem sometimes, but a lot of times it's somebody who is from Bethlehem leaves Bethlehem and something bad happens. Okay, so there's this trilogy where you have Judges 17 and 18, okay, or part 1 of this, where there's basically an idol made, and this guy steals an idol, and then they go and kill the people of Laish. And then there's Judges 19 through 21, where it's basically Israel's version of Sodom and Gomorrah, okay? And then that leads to the Israel's first civil war, okay? But there's a good, the third part of the Bethlehem story is the book of Ruth, where Boaz will be in Bethlehem, will be from Bethlehem, Ruth will be from Bethlehem, and eventually that's where David will be born, and eventually where Jesus will be born as well, showing that he's the second David. Okay, but we'll have to wait for Monday to get into the finishing of Judges, and hopefully into Ruth as well. So it's like all this ugliness is there, and then you have this little jewel of hope with the book of Ruth, where it's like, okay, all this bad stuff, sin, but then God is still working. And you see that with the book of Ruth. And the last word of the book of Ruth is David, moving to the line of the kings.